Good afternoon. Introduction from myself. I'm Karen French from Squire Patton Boggs, lawyers based in our Leeds office. I'm a northern lass through and through, born in South Yorkshire in Rotherham, trained up in Newcastle, so up in the northeast, and I've spent my working career first in Bradford and now in Leeds. I'm delighted to chair this conversation today and with Roger and Jake, and whilst I'm sure they'll be known to the majority of you just by very brief introduction, Roger Marsh OBE DL, he's the chair of the Leeds City Region LEP and has been so since 2013, and he's also the chair of the NP11, the voice that brings the 11 LEPs from the north of England together. Jake Berry MP for Rossendale and Darwen is chair of the Northern Research Group, which is a group of 9 Conservative MPs who were elected to represent the northern constituencies in the last election to press government for more investment into the north. Our conversation today, I think, is really timely. We can discuss some of the proposals that Jake is behind in the Northern Big Bang report, as well as the anticipated devolution white paper. Let's have a good discussion. Kind of gloves off. There'll be lots of things that the two guys agree with, I'm sure, but I don't just want this to be about yes and I agree. I'll hand over to Jake in the first instance, who will give a brief breakdown of the Northern Big Bang proposals. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome everyone who is watching us today. Look, I'm really excited to have the opportunity in partnership with Squire Patton Boggs and the business desk to talk to you a little bit about what the new crop of Northern MPs are working on with government. But before we do that, I want you to cast your mind back to the mid-1980s. Roger will remember, I just about do, when Margaret Thatcher looked at the City of London and said, it is one of the best financial centres in Europe. But on one day, in fact, the 26th of October, we can change the taxation and the regulation of the City of London to take it to the greatest financial centre in the world. And in fact, it is now the biggest global liquidity market. So the Northern Research Group, made up of 80 Conservative colleagues, came together to say, now is the time to have that big bang revolution across the north of England. And very briefly, we focused on a few things. First of all, FDI, foreign direct investment. We've seen over £6 billion invested in Greater Manchester in just the last few years. We want to replicate that across the north of England. Secondly, focus on our prime capabilities of high-tech engineering and manufacturing. And how can we change the taxation system to enable businesses to invest in a tax-efficient way to level up their productivity. And lastly, we need a long overdue look and refresh of how we are governed in the north of England. When people voted to leave the European Union and take back control, as controversial as that was, in many cases they meant, give me control and agency over my own life, don't take it from Brussels to Westminster. This year, we'll see the election of a mayor in Leeds City Region. We have one in Sheffield, Manchester, Liverpool, and the Tees Valley, as well as Newcastle. I want to see that replicated across the north, because I believe, and the Northern Research Group believe, give us the tools we need, and it will be the Northerners who drive forward our economy.
Thanks, Jake. Can I hand over to you, Roger, and just get your views, please, on how the Northern Big Bang report has been received by the MP11 members and businesses? And does the call within it for a Northern Growth Board affect yours, the MP11's plans?
Thank you, Karen, and hello to everybody. And I was just reflecting, Jake, in October 1985, I was living in North America, in Toronto, and one of the projects I was involved with while I was there was the orderly unwinding of the 5th largest commercial bank in Canada. So maybe it's interesting how things change. The important facts of the NRG report about what the funding that's needed, the pace at which we make the investments, and actually the local control, the local decision making, it's very compelling. And there's been good discussion, certainly amongst my colleagues and others, about some of the incentives, which of course we've now seen in the recent budget. But I think the important point is the continued collaboration between both the private and the public sectors. Each do things well, but together we can do things extraordinarily well. And that's what we need. We need extraordinary activity. It becomes the new ordinary. For me, structures are less important than the certainty of projects, programs, but also bigger vision and strategy and action. But I do believe that if things aren't broken, just don't fix them just for the sake of it. And that actually, if there is to be some form of new growth body, that it actually works with the grain of the existing structures and actually is additive, such that, a bit like the mantra of NP11, the things we work on is where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, rather than just another means. So that's why we are supportive of Jake and his colleagues, NRG's thinking. But the key for me is now what's going to be the implementation, but importantly, against what plan? What plan for the North? And perhaps we can discuss that further, Karen, in the course of this conversation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Jake, if I could just turn to you and focus a little bit on devolution. Some of the proposed incentives that we're seeing are welcome, but we're still basically waiting for the delayed devolution white paper. When do you think we can get some real policy changes from government and a commitment to levelling up? And how important do you reckon that devolution is in that levelling up process?
Well, I think it's one of the most important things that the government can do. And in fact, we've seen it be a huge success in Greater Manchester, Liverpool, and in other areas. And particularly, I pay tribute to Andy Burnham. He's a Labour mayor. I'm a Conservative member of Parliament, but I know good when I see it. And I think he's made a huge contribution to that city. And I went with our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. I was with him in his first domestic speech that he made over in Manchester and then in Rotherham later. And in that speech, in his third or fourth week in the job, he said, completing that devolution picture across the north of England needs to be one of my top priorities. I agree with him. I think we need to get on with it. I'm here in Lancashire. We would love to have a mayor of Lancashire. It's that missing X factor in driving our economy. And in terms of the timescales and delays, well, I think we're in a period where we simply can't say. It has been repeatedly delayed. And I think part of that is that there's a very mixed view across government about whether devolution is the right thing to do. I can tell you, having been Northern Powerhouse Minister in the Cabinet until just around this time last year, they don't always want to hear that the best thing for government is to take powers away from government and give them back to local people. So the blob or the machine or whatever you want to call it in Whitehall is striking back. And that is why I think we see this repeated delay. It's unacceptable. I certainly think that we need to see it before the summer as we rebuild after COVID.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I don't know if you would agree with that, Roger. And in terms of your wearing your hat as chair of the MP11, what do you think that group would like to see from the devolution white paper in terms of both its framework and timing? What in your view would you reckon are or should be its top priorities?
Jake makes an interesting point about the lack of congruence, perhaps right across government and within departments, and we see it playing out. Tensions between what sounds like, here you are, we trust you, you've earned your right, go and do what's best for your locality at whatever level, whether regional or down to a town level, and then other aspects that say, well, actually, we'd rather have more control back at the centre. So there seems to be, something of a tussle going on, and all we can do is to try and help influence constructively that, because we all want the same thing. We want a successful, vibrant, economically contributing, health improved North, and we can perhaps touch on some of the consequences of that. The 3 decades of underinvestment. And by the way, I must say, as a proud Northerner, we all are, the North is not looking for favouritism. It just wants fairness. It just wants the tools. So when it comes to devolution, let's be clear that it is accountability for public money, but with authority to get on and do the things that need to be done as quickly as possible so as to improve lives. I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think the private public sector partnership that's been built up over the last decade by LEPs right across the country, but particularly in the north, and I'd like to think we're probably one of the most coherent groups, if not the most coherent group. I think our role in to make sure that strategically against a vision that these new funds, whether you call them levelling up or what, I can't remember its changed name, but the UK Share Prosperity Fund, are actually applied to the right things. And for me, those right things are around the role the North should play, recognising the amount of energy we generate for the whole country, the role around the clean growth, the implementation of the 10-point Green Industrial Revolution plan. And we've already seen that began to play out in Humber and the Tees Valleys. We need to have more of that, number one. Number two, I think it's important that things like the Nesta report that show the missing 4 billion of public investment in research and development that happens elsewhere, but not necessarily in the north, that is levelled up so that our northern universities can really expand out not only their ideas and bring forward those ideas, but importantly that that invention with commercialisation, in other words, to drive the economy. Thirdly, and I think very importantly, and I was reminded of it when I read the Global Britain Local Jobs report launched earlier this week by the UK Board of Trade around actually enhancing trade and inward investment. And just an important stat, it says in there that those businesses that export, and there's a huge potential in the north and it's not fully matured, those businesses that export are usually at least a fifth more productive than those who don't. And one of the puzzles that we face in the north is productivity, and some of its linkages to poor health. But again, we could perhaps pick on that later.
Karen, I'm just going to pull up, if I may, Roger, on something he said, because actually I do want to see favouritism towards the north, and that's what our report calls for. And the reason we want to see that is it's impossible to level up by treating everyone the same when one part of our country starts so far behind in terms of investment in infrastructure, skills and jobs and all the things we are calling for. So in fact, what we need is a decade or 2 decades of the north being treated differently and just getting more than other areas. And once we have a level playing field, once we're starting at the same point, then absolutely let's all compete with no favoritism. But we need to get us there, to get us where we need to be, not for people who live in the north, although we will love it, obviously, but for the whole country. Because for Britain to succeed, the north must succeed, but to get us to a point where we can be as good as we all know we can be, we need a decade at least of public policy favouring investment into northern businesses, northern skills, northern jobs, northern infrastructure particularly. So we are looking for more favourable treatment than our southern cousins. But frankly, they've had it bloody good for the last 50 years. It's a bit time we got our share. I'm
in agreement. Jake, are you, Roger?
I'm not going to be drawn into that sort of rhetoric. I chose my words carefully and illustrated some of the areas where perhaps the converse was true, the lack of being favoured, like the Nesta report that I mentioned, others. I think it's, as with all these things, if we truly want to accelerate the north, there needs to be differentiated investment. If you want to characterise that, Jake, as favouritism, that would be your phraseology for me. But for me, it would be where the investment will make the biggest return nationally for decades to come.
I mean, that actually leads quite nicely into a query that I've got to put to you, which I'll put to you first, Jake, on the free ports. And within the backdrop of the budget last week, as you know, the Chancellor announced the first free ports. And I want to know how you think they play a role in the levelling up process, how important you are, and bearing in mind, and I'm just pulling up my notes in terms of where those free ports are. We know that 3 of them are in the north, Liverpool, Hull and Teesside, but we've got free ports also announced for East Midlands, Felixstowe, Plymouth, Solent and Thames London, which probably takes back to the point that you were just making earlier, Jake, about we as in the north need to have some real preference to actually, if we are going to level up, we have to rebalance, otherwise it's just more for the same.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think free ports are a really good policy. I'm hugely in support of them. But our vision, I think, as the Northern Research Group and as Northern colleagues, is to kind of try and create an environment where the whole of the north is an enterprise zone or a free port. I think the danger with them can be that you have displacement from other areas of the country to free ports to take advantage of significant tax advantages. And that's why we have been calling for things like enhanced capital allowances, which we're really pleased that we got that in the budget, because of course this report was in advance of the budget. We've asked the government to look at things like accelerated planning for new commercial developments in the north. And of course, just last night, we heard that the West Cumbria mine application, which I think is hugely regionally significant to us, is now going to be delayed by a public inquiry, which I think will push it out to over 6 years since they started to try and get that application, which will create 2,500 jobs. Look, we need to have a rapid planning system, a tax system that favours inward investment, and in truth, putting up capital gains taxes, if the playoff for that is putting up capital allowances, well, I don't want to see capital gains taxes rise. I really support that approach because it's encouraging businesses to invest rather than profit take. And that is the way we'll drive the North's economy. So free ports are awesome. They are not just a northern thing. They're a great thing this government has done. But what about everyone else? There's a lot more we could do as well.
Mm. Do you think it's just a way of redirecting money into a certain direction and then other parts of the North, say, losing out because of free ports being implemented in these specific areas?
Well, I think it is going to genuinely stimulate new activity. Yesterday, we had the announcement of the Gigafactory by Hitachi, I think it is, in the Tees port, which is genuinely something new. It's putting the North at the forefront of the green industrial revolution. It is fantastic. But actually, you know, while that's a really important part of our economy, I want people in the Leeds City region and Lancashire and Greater Manchester and other parts of the North who are involved in existing businesses to really have an incentive to invest in their business and in their people to drive up this productivity that Roger has talked about. Because if the North could match the productivity of London and the South East, you know, that North-South divide would be much smaller just by getting up our productivity. So we need a tax system that incentivizes investment in people and property and machinery.
I mean, rail often gets a high profile in these debates, doesn't it? And rightly so. I mean, how important and how likely do you feel it is that an integrated rail plan will actually ever be implemented to a benefit that's going to benefit the northern cities and towns?
Well, I think Roger's the man to answer this because he's pretty heavily embedded in the process, I think. But I just say 2 things about it. I mean, it's absolutely clear that we have creaking infrastructure over in Cumbria, the A595, the main arterial route between Barrow and Whitehaven goes through a farmyard. Until they were off our tracks just very, very recently, the only other country in the world to use pacer trains was Iran, and they had them in the reserve stock because they weren't even good enough for the railways in Iran. So clearly we have a major, major issue. It's road, it's rail, it's digital infrastructure, which is absolutely crucial. So, I mean, Roger, I think, can pick up on the specific question, but what I would say is that you cannot create a global North without dealing with the infrastructure challenge we have. And for me, top of the list actually isn't rail, is digital infrastructure, because I think we've all learned in the last year that we can be very productive sitting at home, working from home when the kids have gone back, thank goodness, I can say. But we can't do that without really smart tech and digital infrastructure. And to me, that would be the top priority to drive our economy.
Thanks, Jake. And Roger, I will interject and let you come back on that point, as well as commenting on, the importance of and scope for private capital investment in the north, as well as government investment too. What do you think that the government commitment to investment matters to the private investors to match? How important is it that they can see this real commitment to the north?
Well, I'll perhaps deal with that question first and come back to the rail and digital connectivity, because Jake and I well, you'll hear, we do agree. In terms of and we've always got to remember, government with great respect is actually our money, taxpayers' money, that it's about the catalytic effect, that leveraging effect. And we've already seen it through the local growth fund, albeit we're just about at the end of that 6-year period. And a number of us in our individual regions are saying, well, so what did we give the economy back for every pound that we got? Invest in a whole range of things. I won't go into the detail of that, but often some of the infrastructure schemes are judged by the current Green Book analysis that if it's more than perhaps 2 or 3 to 1, it's probably worth doing, as compared to perhaps what you might find is that there's double digits. In other words, for every pound the taxpayer puts in, the activities give back at least 10. But that's to be demonstrated. There is a continued appetite despite COVID. There is plenty of money out there. Yes, we've had all of the support mechanisms, but there's still money looking, and internationally as well. And that's why we need to make ourselves even more internationally attractive as a region to invest in projects and activities. If I think of it just a small microcosm, the Northern Powerhouse Investment Fund, which Jake knows all about, which I have the privilege to chair the oversight board, a £500 million fund, I see it very much as a pilot for investing in SMEs from microfinance through to equity. Actually, the autumn statement last year added 100 million to it to make that £500 million fund. It's almost half deployed. I'd like to see NPIF 2 or something like it that's got a nought on the end of it, because again, that's another mechanism by which we can generate support investment. The other aspect as well is the kind of growing interest, and I like to think I've had some part in this with the likes of Channel 4, Burberry, Reed Smith, to name a few, of actually North Shoring, recognising not only is there's a lower operating cost, but there's ready access to talent. If I look across the north, its universities are producing high quality graduates that in some places end up as a brain drain to other parts of the economy that need them now. Well, actually, if we can create the opportunities and the jobs, then they don't need to go anywhere further. And I actually think the business leadership in partnership with the public sector, whether at local level or at national level, is a model that's proven its worth. But then people would say, you would say that, wouldn't you? But I think it stands scrutiny. I think it does stand scrutiny. If I think about the LEP network nationally, there are probably something like 1,200 people like me who basically give their time because they believe in the agenda. And the other thing I would say is that poverty isn't just limited to the north. There are some parts of the south where it's embedded. So, but going back to that connectivity point, intercity and intra-region, there isn't either or, it's both. And it's also about how it enables. And importantly, if I take something like the Northern Powerhouse Rail, the lengthy debates that I've participated in around why you would connect a city like Bradford, which in population terms is often either 5th or 6th nationally, with a lot of young people with pent-up opportunity, why you wouldn't do that for a one-off cost, assuming you can afford it, of course, and that's always a big point, a one-off cost of a city centre railway station compared to the unknown cost of managing underperformance and all that brings for decades hence. But Jake again makes a good point, and again I'll use a statistic to illustrate my point. Imagine the fact an eighth of the north is not actually, the population of the north is not properly connected to the internet in one way or the other, and an eighth of our population, as compared to about half as much in London southeast. So there's again another part of that gap, and we've seen some of that play out in terms of young people's education during the pandemic, and those families who don't have access to a piece of kit, let alone as a consequence access to the internet in 2021. So I agree with Jake. If somebody said to me, well, you can have one thing, I'd want that digital access top of my list, but it's not, and the rest isn't just nice to have, the rest is need to have to unleash and connect in, to Jake's point about free ports. If it's impossible to get from Goole, well, we're going to build a new train factory, Siemens is going to create a new train factory and produce air-conditioned carriages for the underground, for example, they need to be properly connected with infrastructure that represents a global nation, a global trading nation in 2021, not barely repaired from perhaps 1821 or certainly that soon thereafter.
If I could take what you've said there, Roger, and put this to Jake, as a question around the big asks in your report, in the Northern Research Group report. We've obviously seen movement on some of the items that you're wanting, but genuinely, Jake, how optimistic do you feel you are of government really looking carefully at the balance of those points and making the report into reality, bringing it forward so that not only the people who live here in our towns and cities, but those who might decide to come here can really get a benefit from that? How optimistic do you feel?
Well, I'm look, in terms of the capital allowances, I really welcome what Rishi Sunak and the Treasury and the government did at the budget. I mean, I think for lots of people who are in service jobs in other parts of the country and other parts of the economy, they probably don't realise what a huge bonus that is to our high-skilled manufacturing and engineering economy. So I do really welcome that. More generally on the government's agenda, where I think we'll go next, look, I welcome things like the Levelling Up Fund, but I don't think that they recognise the scale of the challenge. So £4 billion is £7 million per constituency in England. And I think around towns surrounding me, like Rawtenstall or Accrington or Blackburn, £7 million is a king's ransom for all of us, but invested in those towns with the serious challenges they have and the serious opportunities isn't really going to be enough. And that's why I go back to what I started by saying, is that we focused on FDI. So if you look at the £6 billion plus, more than 1.5 times the Levelling Up Fund invested in Greater Manchester, one city region, that is paying for things you would normally expect the government to pay for. So it's building, for example, thousands of affordable social homes for people who live in Greater Manchester. So that's why I hope the next thing the government will give serious consideration to, what we welcome everything that they've done so far, is this idea of about how we market the north of England as the landing pad for global investment. And I completely, Roger and I have had many discussions about this. I completely agree with Roger that the MP11 and the mayors and the existing infrastructure do seem to be the right place in the first instance to go to develop that. And of course, it's hugely encouraging that we now have the Office of International Investment headed by Lord Lister, formerly Chief of Staff in Downing Street. But I don't think in the north, frankly, I don't think there's enough money on offer from the government to transform our economy. I actually suspect that there isn't enough money in government, having had to pay for COVID to do everything that we want. So let's work in partnership with them and look to the rest of the world. And I think if we do that, we can see that sort of rapid change. And the reason we call this report the Big Bang is in just over a decade, we transformed as a nation the City of London, which is to the huge benefit of everyone who lives in this country, whether you happen to be in the north, south, east or west, Scotland, England, Wales or Northern Ireland. And I think we can see a similar change across the north of England to benefit our entire United Kingdom. This isn't just about the north doing well, because when the north does well, the whole of the United Kingdom succeeds. And that absolutely should be our ambition as citizens of this nation, but also as proud northerners as well.
Thanks. And we're pretty short on time here, guys. We've hit 1 o'clock and we haven't even touched on supply chains, issues in the north through Brexit, the benefits and challenges that the green economy are going to bring to the north. I'd just like, if I can, to just squeeze one last question into you both as a delivery to those on the call who probably are not school leavers or school attendees themselves, school children, but perhaps are parents of those who've got kids who are now approaching school leaving age. They've had a really tough, this is the second tough academic year for them, doing GCSEs, A-levels. In terms of those that are being schooled in the north and coming into our economy in the next few years, do you think that we realistically can offer something in the north that's going to be a brighter, better place for them, to keep them in the north and to prevent these south shoring down to London?
Want me to start that? So Jake, perhaps have the last word in the whole thing. I think we're already on that journey, and it's about scale. The heart of Jake's report. It's about the scale at which we do it, and that's where the real levelling up dividend will be delivered at scale and pace. And I just would like to reflect what Jake said about that 4 billion fund. You know, any money is welcome, but it's about, is it enough to make a massive difference rather than just perhaps maintain the status quo? And just so people are aware, pre-COVID, the fiscal deficit the North runs is about 50 billion per annum, 50 billion pounds per annum of cash needed from elsewhere, or put another way, £1 billion a week, and you can then measure what 4 billion looks like. So for me, continuing the investment in facilities and curricula, but importantly matching it, and this is where the partnership between the private and the public sector, whether it be LEPs, local authorities, mayoral combined authorities, county councils or whatever, to position the North as open globally and attract, as they've done in Greater Manchester and other parts of the North, playing to their strengths, to provide those great opportunities for our young men and women, which actually inspire them to get as well educated as they can. And for people like Jake as an elected, and people like me who are interested and committed, to ensure that we give them, you know, the best opportunities that we're able to do, because building back better and all these other phraseologies will only be successful if the investment in the next generation maxes out the economic and hopefully thereby the societal improvements that we need. And, you know, we need them like yesterday, not sometime tomorrow.
Well,
Jake, any closing words from you on that?
yeah, I mean, very quickly, Roger's absolutely right to pick up on this point of the north-south educational divide. It is a moral imperative, I think, for us as Northerners and for this government that we close that. There is no reason whatsoever that my 3 kids in the north of England should get a worse education just because we happen to be in the north than if we, you know, lived in Surrey or Kent. I mean, it's just a completely unacceptable set of statistics, and we have to do something to close it. But I'll finish with this, actually, just on, you know, what do people do next? One of the most memorable things political statements I can ever remember was the statement by Tony Blair's government just before then opposition, before the 1997 election, about 50% of young people going to university. For people like my parents and our family friends, that changed people's view of university to something where other people's kids went, to something where my kids could go or our kids could go. I would like to see the government make a similar pledge on apprenticeships. My personal view is that at least 50% of young people should go down an apprenticeship route to work and have highly paid, secure jobs in the north of England. And without picking up our sponsors too much, I know that Squire Patton Boggs has just started in a really serious way to recruit trainee solicitors and other people through apprenticeships. And I think that really shows that for those, you know, high value jobs with leading businesses in the north, from BAE Systems to service providers like Squire Patton Boggs or media organisations like the Business Desk, apprenticeships are the right way to go. So I hope if there's no young people listening, their parents may prick up their ears. We have brilliant universities in the north of England, but we need a diverse educational offer that values vocational skills and highly academic skills in our brilliant university and puts them at the same level.
Thanks for those words, Jake, and thank you to you both, Roger and Jake, and the business desk for hosting today's conversation. Enjoy the rest of your day and weekend, guys.